Almost 200 years ago, thousands of slaves on plantations along the East Coast rebelled. Yet the Demerara Slave Rebellion of 1823 is often eclipsed by events in 1763. This reading draws on two main sources. The first is the definitive study by the Brazilian historian Emilia Viotti da Costa, titled Crowns of Glory, Tears of Blood. The second source is Joshua Bryant, who produced detailed drawings of the events. Bryant was an eyewitness. An artist living in Demerara at the time, he served in one of the regiments assembled to repress the rebellion. And in 1824, his account of an insurrection of the Negro slaves in the colony of Demerara was printed at the Guyana Chronicle. It was dedicated to the governor, Moray. And many planters and officers involved in suppressing the rebellion were listed as subscribers. Now, these are edited extracts. Most of those involved in the conspiracy had known each other for years. Sam, Tony, Cato, Tully had all known Jack Gladstone since he was a little boy. Theirs were long-standing relationships involving years of shared pleasures and pains. Jack Gladstone was about 30 years old at the time. He lived at Success, one of the plantations owned by John Gladstone. He carried the surname of the master. Since the missionaries had arrived, slaves had added new bonds to those they already had. Every week, the bonds of solidarity were ritualized and celebrated in the chapel. Conversion to Christianity, however, could have contradictory effects. It could create new bonds, but it could also destroy old ones. Converted slaves may have stopped playing their drums and practicing their ritual mysteries in nearby woods, although it is almost certain that many did not. They may have abandoned some of the old ways of celebrating the dead, but they acquired new ones, and they continue to come together for funerals or on holidays such as Easter, Whitsunday, or Christmas, holidays that the white man had forced slaves to incorporate into their culture. More important, John Ray and John Smith, the missionaries from the London Missionary Society, had given them new legitimate reasons to assemble. John Smith's system of designating one slave on each plantation to be the teacher and to assist the others in learning the catechism gave the slaves a new pretext for meeting. Although it would be a mistake to think that all those who plotted the rebellion were teachers and deacons, as was insinuated during the trial. It is still true that several were implicated in the plot. Apparently, this was the case with Seaton, who was a teacher at Success, and William at Chateau Margaux, David at Le Bon Intention, LBI, Jackie Reed at Douche-Fort, Luke at Friendship, Joseph at Bachelor's Adventure, and Sandy at Nonpareil. It is also true that Jack Gladstone used this network to communicate with the slaves at various plantations. These new arrangements only multiplied the many opportunities the slaves already had to know each other, trust each other, communicate with each other, and finally, to plot with each other. As became obvious during the trials, the slaves who plotted the rebellion moved around with a great deal of freedom. At nights, they sneaked off their plantations and walked miles to visit their friends. They also invented many excuses to leave their plantations. In the dry season, many slaves went to fetch water at Livry Souvenir, where there was a permanent spring. And since wives and husbands, parents and children were often separated, sold away, and lived on different plantations, slaves found pretexts of all sorts where they needed a pass for a day or two. They also received permission to go to Sunday markets to sell their produce of their own gardens and the fowls and pigs they sometimes raised. Or they were sent to town on errands. And despite persecution and harassment from masters, large numbers of slaves had met at the Bethel Chapel at Livry Souvenir. Aside from the more obvious links among slaves, there were others more difficult to trace, either because they escaped the perception of the whites and so left few documentary traces, or because they were not crucial after all. But it is intriguing to notice that among the slaves who plotted the rebellion, and later among the rebels, many were Coromantee. It is difficult to say how many. Was this a coincidence? Jack Gladstone's father, Quamina, was described as a Coromantee. What about all the Quachees, Cudjos, Quambinos, Quacows, Quaws, Coffees, and Quaminas, who were in one way or the other accused of being involved in the plot or the rebellion? They were Quacos from Chateau Margaux, Quaco from Success, Quamina from Nuenzul, Quambino from Chateau Margaux, Cudjo from Porter's Hope, Cudjos from Luzignan. All these names appearing on the list of men arrested, punished, or executed for participating in the rebellion were typical Coromantee. or Akan weekday names and were common proper names in many communities on the west coast of Africa. And indeed, immediately before the abolition of the slave trade, many slaves sold in Demerara were advertised as coming from the Gold Coast, not to mention others who had been transported from Jamaica and the quarantine in Berbice, where there had been a great concentration of Coromantee. The Coromantee were known for their rebelliousness and had been responsible for a great number of risings in the New World. One of the most dramatic was the slave rebellion of 1763 in Berbice. And after that rebellion was suppressed, there had been continuing sporadic conspiracies and small uprisings, not only in Berbice, but in Demerara and Essequibo as well. The presence of so many Coromantee among those who plotted and joined the 1823 rebellion in Demerara makes more plausible the hypothesis that aside from all the other forms of loyalties born out of a shared experience of oppression in the New World, traditional ethnic loyalties may have played a significant role. Equally important seem to have been bonds created by language. It is possible that even those who were ethnic groups constantly at war in Africa, but who spoke the same language, would become allies in the New World. This hypothesis is all the more plausible because African language would have counted for much in an area where half of the slaves were African-born, an area of great linguistic confusion, where some slaves spoke only Dutch, others English, and others a patois that included Spanish, English, Dutch, and sometimes even Portuguese and French words. Does the predominance of carpenters and other skilled slaves among the leaders indicate the survival in Demerara of artisan secret societies, which were common in many parts of Africa? Or should it be explained by loyalties formed in the workplace? Could it be that when Kwamina was chosen by the Bethel congregation in 1817 to be a deacon, the congregation was only redefining and confirming a traditional role? That might explain the extraordinary respect Kwamina seems to have had from his peers. Some slaves, mostly drivers and domestic servants, out of fear or calculation, or some sort of devotion towards their masters, or hostility towards their peers, opposed the rebellion. These incidents reveal that divisions among the slaves are indicative of the difficulties slaves had to face in planning a large-scale rebellion. Yet, as the rebellion showed, division could for the most part be overcome. Among those who rose up, there were head people and field workers, men and women, Christian and non-Christian, free blacks and slaves, Africans and Creoles, blacks and mulattoes, young and old, Coromantees, Congos, Papos, Mandingos, and probably others whose identities are lost to us. If a common experience united them, it was slavery. And slaves in Demerara had a long history of individual and collective day-to-day resistance, which had strengthened their commitment to their rights and had helped to consolidate links of solidarity and to create leadership. Particularly important in the making of the rebellion were the networks that brought the plotters together. They visited each other, had breakfast together, and gathered at nights to rehearse the catechism and to learn to read. They met along the roads, in shops, in fields, on the rivers, at the harbors, in the chapel, and at the Sunday market. They talked and talked and dreamed, reassuring each other, repeating the same tales and same news over and over again, sounding each time more convincing. They plotted. It was this dream and this hope that finally brought a number of slaves together on Sunday afternoon, August 17th, to make final preparation for the rebellion. Around 3 or 4 o'clock after service, they met at the Success Middle Walk to decide the strategy they should follow. According to participants' later accounts, Jack Gladstone played an important role. He ordered the slaves to stand together, facing each other, those from the same estate standing by each other, to hold a council about taking hold of the white people. He then read a letter from Joe Simpson, saying that from what he had seen in his master's papers, the slaves were to be free and that a new governor was expected very soon, so the slaves should wait. Several people spoke. Some said that they should rise, others that they should wait. Kwame of Nabacalis brought up the example of Barbados, where the people had risen in the same manner and many had been killed. Sandy suggested that the slaves lay down their tools and then go to town to ask for another free day besides Sunday. But Sandy's suggestion was not accepted, perhaps because most people wanted freedom and not just another free day a week. They agreed with Paris when he argued that if they simply laid down their tools, the slaves, men and women, would be shot like fools. Joseph of Batchelor's Adventure and Bristol proposed to break up the bridges, but it was decided that they only should break the bridges if they saw the troops coming. After much debate, the slaves had finally agreed to begin the uprising Monday evening. The rebels intended to force the governor to give them freedom, or at least some days a week. The firing of guns on the coast was to be the signal. Billy and Jackie Reed were to command the Mahaica region. Joseph, Telemachus, and Sandy were to start a bachelor's adventure and work their way westward down the coast till they met Paris, and eastward on the Mahaica side until they met Jackie Reed. Mars and Azor were to lead as far as they could toward town. Slaves from Thomas were to come up the coast in the direction of Success and not attempt to go to town, where the military power of the colony was concentrated. Kwamina tried to stop Jack, but he dismissed his father roughly. "You are an old fool. The thing people have got, you won't have them have." Before the meeting, Kwamina, Seaton, Shute, and Peter had gone to the missionary John Smith's house, as they usually did on Sundays after service, to tell him goodbye. Smith overheard Kwamina and Seaton talking in a low tone of voice about the new laws and asked them what they were talking about. Kwamina answered evasively, "Nothing in particular, sir. We are only saying it would be good to send our managers to town to fetch up the new law." Smith tried to dissuade them, arguing that such behavior would irritate the government and have the opposite effect. Smith's words may have affected Kwamina, but it was too late to stop the uprising. After the final meeting at Success, the slaves returned to their plantations and told others that they were to rise up on Monday night. On Monday morning, Kwamina insisted that Jack postpone the plan until John Smith could get hold of a letter which had been sent to the governor. Kwamina was probably referring to the instructions sent to Governor Moray by the British government. Jack replied that all Negroes of the estate had gone to work and there was no way to reach them. Kwamina did not give up. He asked Peter Hood, a carpenter who was working at Leary Souvenir, to send word to the estates down the coast. That same morning, Azor, a field slave belonging to Van Kooten, sent his son to ask Kwamina what they were to do. Kwamina told the boy that they must stop. Kwamina's attempt to postpone, if not prevent, the rebellion may explain why slaves did not rise in any of the estate towards town, except at Pleasance and Brothers. The rebellion started at Sussex and quickly spread to the neighboring plantations. Beginning around the 6 in the evening, is the sound of shell horns and drums, and continuing through the night 9 to 12,000 slaves from about 60 East Coast plantations surrounded main houses, put overseas and managers in the stocks, and seized their arms and ammunition. When they met resistance, they used force. Years of frustration and repression were suddenly released. For a short time, slaves turned the world upside down. Slaves became masters, and masters became slaves. Just as masters had uprooted them from their traditional environment and culture, appropriating their labor, given them new names, forced them to learn a new language, and imposed on them new roles, slaves appropriated their master's language and their symbols of power and property. Slaves spoke of laws coming out from England. They spoke of rights. They used their master's whips and put their masters in the stocks. By the middle of the night, the old African shells and drums were silent. Only the sound of European guns was heard. Telemachus, Sandy, and Jack Gladstone, and a few others were seen on different plantations, restraining the rebels, trying to stop looting, to prevent acts of violence against the whites. Several slaves later implicated in the rebellion. Quamina from Success, Bristol from Chateau Margaux, Paul from Friendship, Jack Reed from Dashfour, Joseph and Telemachus from Bachelor's Adventure, and many others were deacons or teachers in John Smith's chapel. Their participation in the slave rebellion led the authorities to suspect Smith of involvement. His role, however, seems to have been more that of a pacifier than instigator. It was probably due to his influence and to the active role several members of his chapel played in the organization of the uprising that the level of slave violence was so low. Only 2 or 3 white men were killed. And except in one instance, no injury was done to any white woman. For the most part, the rebels showed considerable restraint and discipline. On Monday 18th and Tuesday 19th August, slaves went in large groups to plantation other than those where they lived and worked, so they would not be recognized. They were armed with cutlasses, guns, and other weapons. They broke into plantation houses and took arms and ammunition, seized managers, owners, and visitors, and put them in the stocks. A few slaves were left to stand guard while the crowd moved on to other plantations, where similar scenes took place. There were cases of looting and property destruction. The slave broke glasses, doors, windows, and furniture. They destroyed several bridges on a few plantations where whites barricaded themselves in the main house. Slaves set fire to it. At others, they expressed their hostility to the owners, managers, doctors, and overseers by cursing and beating them up. The few slaves, mostly drivers and house servants, who sided with their masters were beaten and put in the stocks. The trial records show that only a small group of slaves had been privy to the conspiracy. Most slaves were ignorant of the plan until the day before the uprising. By Monday night, Governor Moray had no doubt that the slaves were in rebellion. He had seen it with his own eyes. On his way back to town from Les Ridieux, where he had gone to discuss the situation with planters and managers, Moray had come upon a group of about 40 rebels armed with cutlasses. When he asked what they wanted, they replied, "Our rights." The governor explained that he had received instructions from England that would benefit them. The abolition of the flogging of females and the prohibition against carrying whips into the fields were but the first steps. These things, the slaves said, were no comfort to them. God had made them of the same flesh and blood as the whites. They were tired of being slaves. Their good king had sent orders that they should be free, and they would not work anymore. The governor told the rebels that he would negotiate with them only if they laid down their arms. They refused. He ordered them to return to their plantations and promised to meet with them the next day at Felicity. They did not move. By this time, their numbers had grown to more than 200. Probably fearing that the situation would get out of control, he decided to leave. He drove away under the shouts of, "Go, go." When he got back to Georgetown, after his encounter with the rebels, Moray convened a meeting of the Court of Policy and summoned the militia. He dispatched to the East Coast a detachment from the 24th North British Fusiliers and the 1st West Indian Regiment. A second detachment of the 21st Fusiliers followed. The next day, the colony woke up in a state of war. Governor Moray had declared martial law. All stores in Georgetown were closed. Ladies sought refuge in the vessels in the harbor. Only soldiers and militiamen were seen in the streets. The Scottish Presbyterian Church became the gathering point for the militia. By Tuesday, 19th August, it was reported that a large group of insurgents had gathered in the neighborhood of Plantation Elizabeth Hall and Batchelor's Adventure. The detachments arrived at Batchelor's Adventure on Wednesday, 20th August. There they found themselves suddenly surrounded by an enormous crowd of slaves. The slaves were all armed, some with muskets, others with cutlasses. The officers resolved that a deputation with a flag of truce should be sent to the insurgents, persuade them to lay down their arms and disperse. Colonel Leahy, Captain Crowell, and one or two captains of the regular troops went on the mission. When they asked the slaves what they wanted, they replied, "Mazat are too bad. Make we work Sundays. No let we go to chapel. No give time for work in the garden. Lick art, we too much. We hear, but true great buckler give we free. And massa, no let we have nothing. From among the crowd, Jack Gladstone stepped forward and handed to Leahy a paper signed by several managers saying that they had been well treated by the rebels. Leahy responded by giving Jack a copy of the governor's proclamation of martial law. He then ordered the slave to lay down their arms and return to their work. But the rebels did not move. Soldiers and slaves stood watching each other, the tension growing. Eventually, people in the crowd started calling out, "Catch him, the big buckler, tie him, tie him." Hearing this, Leahy spurred his horse and galloped towards the plantation building and ordered the soldiers to attack. The soldiers poured in volley after volley. The slaves returned the fire, but soon began to run, leaping the trenches into which many tumbled lifeless. Many were shot down on the road and in the cotton fields. By noon, the roadside was littered with dead bodies. About 200 slaves had been killed. From Batchelor's adventure, the troops continued towards Mahaica, going from one plantation to another, liberating managers and overseas from the stocks. Here and there, they met groups of slaves, but after small skirmishes, the slaves would withdraw to the bushy areas at the backs of the plantations. Repression fell violently upon the rebels. The moment called for a ritual. It was necessary to show who had power and who must obey, and to make fear stronger than hope. After summary trials, alleged rebel leaders were executed on the plantations by the troops. The slaves' actual degree of involvement in the rebellion mattered little. The officers were only interested in reasserting their authority and terrifying the slaves. The mock trials they conducted were not born out of an abstract commitment to justice, but rather out of the desire to re-establish the order the slaves had temporarily inverted. The slaves' official trials had already started in Georgetown on the 25th of August. Summary executions on the plantation continued for several days. At the Bachelor, 2 slaves were shot and then decapitated by the head driver. Their heads were affixed to poles on the road in front of the estate. In early September, Jack Gladstone was captured at Chacomagos and stood trial. Comina was not found until mid-September. He was finally spotted in an area of heavy bush where he could not be easily seized. The tracker who first saw him ordered him to stop, but Comina neither stopped nor ran. Instead, he went on walking without looking back, as if he had not heard the order. He seemed to be determined to be killed rather than arrested. As he was about to get out of sight, the Indians shot him through the arms and temples. His body was carried back to Success by slaves who had been caught during the raids. On September 17, a gibbet was erected on the road in front of Success, surrounded by the assembled slaves of the plantation. A party of militia under arms and Indians, Pamina's body was hung up in chains. 72 slaves were tried between August 1823 and January 1824. 51 were condemned to death. 33 of these were executed, of which 10 were decapitated and their head stuck on poles on the roadside. 16 were flogged. The others were acquitted. Governor Moray requested mercy for Jack Gladstone and 14 slaves who had been condemned to die. Moray knew that executing Jack would only make him a hero. Gladstone was banished to St. Lucia. 10 years after the rebellion in Demerara, the British government abolished slavery in the colonies and created a system of apprenticeship. Ex-slaves and ex-mastered entered a new contest over the meaning of freedom.